All right, buckle up, listeners, because this deep dive is going to be a wild one. We're jumping headfirst into the world of international intrigue, conspiracies, all that good stuff. Today, it's Dick Morris, and here come the black helicopters. UN global governance and the loss of freedom.
Yeah, this one's a doozy. Sounds like our listener wants to understand the arguments against a stronger UN, and Morris really doesn't pull any punches.
No kidding. Just the title alone tells you that much. So
Yeah.
lay it on us. What's the main gist? What has Morris so fired up about the UN?
Well, he thinks that certain UN initiatives, and he names a few specifically, are basically a slippery slope towards surrendering national sovereignty, particularly for the U.S. He uses the Law of the Sea Treaty, LOST, and the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT, as his prime examples.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit. What is it about these treaties that has him so riled up?
So, take LOST, the Law of the Sea Treaty. It sets up this thing called the International Seabed Authority, the SAA. Morris claims that this body, this ISA, would have the power to directly tax offshore drilling operations.
Directly taxed, like imposed by the UN.
Yep. That's his argument, yep. And get this, he says it could be as high as 7%, with all that revenue getting redistributed to, you guessed it, developing nations.
Whoa, 7% is no joke. I can see why he's crying foul. He's basically saying this is a sneaky way to redistribute global wealth.
That's the heart of it. He sees this global governance push not just as environmental protection or helping poorer countries, but a fundamental power shift. Who controls the world's resources, that sort of thing. He even brings up climate change agreements, like that proposed Green Climate Fund, which he says could balloon to almost $2 trillion. And guess who's footing most of that bill?
On a guess, developed nations.
Bingo! So we're talking trillions of dollars potentially changing hands here. It's a bold claim, no doubt.
No kidding. But it's not just about the money, right? He's also got beef with how the UN itself operates, how it makes decisions.
Oh, absolutely. He's very vocal about the UN's one nation, one vote system. He calls it completely undemocratic because it gives a country with a tiny population the same voting power as, say, the United States.
So hypothetically, a country with a few million people has the same say as one with hundreds of millions.
That's his point, yeah. He even uses the most extreme example. The 97 least populated UN members, they only have 241 million people combined, but theoretically they could outvote the rest of the entire world, which has over 7 billion.
See, now that's just mind-boggling to me. I get why that wouldn't sit well with some people. But is he saying smaller countries shouldn't get a say at all?
It's more nuanced than that. His worry is that the current system lets countries with really iffy human rights records, or those known for corruption, have way too much influence.
So he's basically saying there's a danger of the UN becoming a platform for, shall we say, less than democratic forces.
That's a core part of his argument for sure. And to illustrate this point, he brings up some past UN scandals, like that whole oil for food program back in the Saddam Hussein days.
Oh, right. Vaguely rings a bell. Remind me how that one went down again.
It was supposed to let Iraq sell oil to pay for humanitarian aid, right?
Right.
But it became a massive corruption scheme. UN officials allegedly taking bribes, the program potentially funding Hussein's regime instead of helping people. Not a good look.
Yeah, not exactly a ringing endorsement for UN transparency and accountability there.
Exactly. And Morris uses this, among other examples, to basically say, hey, they've messed up before, so why give them even more power? And it's not just about, money and voting power. Morris is also really worried about the UN getting its hands on, well, let's call them critical resources. I'm talking about things like the internet, maybe even outer space.
Okay, so this is where some folks might say he's gone full black helicopter conspiracy theory on us. I mean, he did title the book, Here Come the Black Helicopters.
Yeah.
Is he being literal here? Like, does he actually believe that?
That's a really good point, and it gets to the heart of how he frames his arguments. It's important to note that Morris himself even talks about that black helicopter metaphor. He's not saying, like, UN soldiers are going to rappel down from choppers and take over Main Street, USA or anything.
So what's he getting at then with that imagery? What's the real message?
I think he's tapping into this primal fear a lot of people have. The fear of losing control, of being at the mercy of this global body that doesn't really answer to everyday people. And he argues this loss of freedom, it wouldn't be this sudden dramatic thing. It would happen slowly, almost without us realizing it.
A kind of creeping control, you're saying. So how does the internet, how does outer space play into this whole thing?
Well, he brings up the UN's International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, and their attempts to regulate the internet. He sees this as a backdoor to censorship, a way to control the flow of information globally.
Interesting. So it's not so much the UN banning cat videos, but who gets to set the rules of the game for something as essential as the internet?
You got it. And then there's this proposed code of conduct for outer space activities. Morris sees this as a way to limit what the U.S. can do in space, especially when it comes to missile defense systems, which he believes are crucial.
So his argument is that it's not just about what happens here on Earth, but about American power and security in space too, huh?
Precisely. He sees a strong U.S. presence in space as vital to deterring other countries from, let's say, not-so-friendly actions. It all ties back into his core argument: protecting national sovereignty, not giving more power to international groups.
Right. So we've covered his anxieties about sovereignty, about wealth redistribution, the UN structure, even controlling things like the internet and space. Does he offer any solutions, though? Or does he think the UN is totally beyond saving?
Well, he's not completely hopeless. He does say that progress is being made on some global issues, even without these binding UN agreements. He actually points to the U.S.'s own record on reducing greenhouse gases.
Interesting. So he thinks individual countries should take the initiative.
Exactly. He's all about countries acting in their own best interest, using their own resources and capabilities.
Makes sense. But what about issues that really need global cooperation? Climate change, for example. Does he address that?
He does, and this is where his critique of UN initiatives like Agenda 21 comes into play. Remember that one?
Vaguely. Give us a refresher.
Agenda 21 is all about sustainable living, right? But Morris sees it as the UN overreaching, trying to dictate how people live their lives, all under the guise of saving the environment.
Whoa. Dictate how people live their lives. That's a pretty serious accusation. What specifically does he have in mind?
He points to things like encouraging people to live in densely packed cities, putting limits on car ownership, even restricting how much of certain resources we use. He paints a picture of a world with way less individual freedom, all in the name of environmentalism.
So to put it bluntly, he thinks the UN wants to tell us how to live.
That's the gist of his argument about Agenda 21, for sure. Global governance gone way too far, stepping on individual rights and national sovereignty.
Okay, so this is getting pretty heavy. And just to be clear to our listeners, these are Morris's concerns, right? We're trying to accurately present his viewpoint, but we're not necessarily saying we agree with everything he says. It's up to you, our listeners, to decide what you make of it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's crucial to remember that this is just one perspective, and it's vital to seek out diverse opinions and critically assess the evidence on these complex topics.
So we've got Morris worried sick about Agenda 21, about this looming global governance threat. But what's his alternative? Is he saying we should just throw our hands up about global issues?
Not really. I mean, he's not denying that these global problems exist, but he's super skeptical of the UN's ability to actually solve them. He believes the U.S. is in a much better position to lead the way, but not by forcing UN rules on everyone.
So what, like leading by example instead?
That's the general idea, yeah. He's all about the U.S. focusing on its own strengths. Our technology, our free market system, using those to come up with solutions that other countries can then, choose to adopt.
Makes sense. But what about issues that really do need global teamwork, like climate change, for example? How does that fit into his viewpoint?
Well, he argues that the U.S. has already made some serious progress on environmental issues without being shackled by UN agreements. He'll point to things like fewer coal-fired power plants, more use of natural gas, better fuel efficiency in cars, all evidence that America's on the right track, but doing it their own way.
So he's basically saying, hey, we're already taking care of business without the UN breathing down our necks.
That's the gist, yeah. He's putting his faith in American innovation and market forces being more effective in the long run than some top-down rules from what he sees as a potentially corrupt and inefficient UN. He even brings up historical examples where the U.S. took charge on the world stage without giving up its sovereignty.
Gotcha. Let me guess, he's a big fan of the Reagan playbook.
You know it. He talks about Reagan pulling out of UNESCO. That's the UN's culture and education arm. For Morris, that was a bold move, America standing up for its principles, even when it meant going against the global tide. And he argues it ultimately made the U.S. stronger on the world stage.
Interesting stuff. So to wrap this up, it seems like Morris is really advocating for a more independent, more assertive America in global affairs, one that trusts its own judgment and isn't afraid to forge its own path.
You got it. Agree with him or not, you got to admit, Morris really challenges the status quo with this book. Makes you think about the role of the UN, about global governance in general, about that balance between working together globally and maintaining national sovereignty.
He certainly doesn't shy away from a debate, that's for sure. I bet this book has sparked some pretty lively conversations. But whether you're on board with him or not, you can't deny the guy's passion. It really jumps off the page.
Absolutely. Love him or hate him, he knows how to write a compelling argument. Vivid language, historical examples, even a little bit of fear-mongering thrown in for good measure.
Right.
He paints a picture of a world where American sovereignty is under constant threat, and he wants people to pay attention.
Well, on that note, I'd say we've given our listeners plenty to unpack today. We dove into those core arguments Dick Morris makes in Here Come the Black Helicopters. His worries about sovereignty, about wealth redistribution, his skepticism of the UN structure, its effectiveness. We covered it all.
And as always, we want to emphasize the importance of seeking out different viewpoints. Don't just take our word for it, or even Morris's. Read up, think critically, form your own opinions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. After all, that's what the deep dive is all about. Giving you, the listeners, the tools to be informed, engaged citizens.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end when this episode does. Keep exploring these topics. Keep challenging your own assumptions. That's how we grow.
Because the future of global governance, America's place in it all, this is going to impact all of us for generations to come.
And that, my friend, is a conversation worth having.